We are diving deep today, tackling an intellectual figure who, well, he fundamentally tore up the rulebook on how we understand power, knowledge, and even our own sexuality.
We're talking about Michel Foucault.
Michel Foucault, and when you say he tore up the rulebook, that's not an exaggeration.
Not at all. Foucault, born Paul Michel Foucault in 1926, wasn't just a historian or a philosopher. He was, you could say, a master genealogist of the modern world.
A genealogist. What does that mean in this context?
It means he traced the lineage of our ideas. His work, which spanned his entire life until his death in 1984, it just fundamentally challenged the assumption that concepts like, say, truth or sanity or sexuality are natural.
Or timeless.
Or timeless, exactly.
Yeah.
He showed us that they are, in fact, historical inventions, things that were created at a specific time for a specific reason.
Absolutely. And when we talk about influence, Foucault is a true heavyweight. I mean, he is consistently cited as one of the most essential, and let's be honest, often explosive post-World War II scholars.
His ideas are they're everywhere in modern thought.
They really are. So our mission today is to try and navigate his very complex life and work. We want to extract the core concepts, power, knowledge, subjectivity, and really understand why his radical analysis of institutional control remains so indispensable for analyzing the 21st century.
That's the core mission. Foucault's whole career was really dedicated to demonstrating the intricate, and I'd say often insidious, relationship between power, knowledge, and liberty.
Right.
He wanted to show us how established authorities, be they medical, penal, academic, how they deploy what is presented as scientific knowledge as a very sophisticated and deeply effective form of social control.
And always through institutions.
Always through institutions.
And to give you, the listener, a sense of scale here, we aren't just discussing some campus celebrity. The historical analysis he performed in works like Discipline and Punish and The History of Sexuality. They are among the 25 most cited social science books of all time.
That is it's a staggering reach for someone dealing with such dense academic material.
It is.
The fact that a historian's texts on, the prison system and the history of medicine can achieve that status, it just tells you how profoundly they resonated.
So today, we're going to trace the path of the man who went from being an obsessive, a deeply troubled youth, someone who openly indulged in what he called limit experiences, to becoming this high-flying academic who radically redefined how we understand the purpose of prisons, the function of hospitals, and maybe most crucially, our most intimate sense of self.
Okay, so let's unpack this journey. Because the person who would become this great critic of institutions, he started out firmly inside them.
Oh, very much so. Paul Michel Foucault was born in Poitiers. His family was prosperous, upper middle class, socially very conservative.
It's hard to reconcile that kind of stable traditional background with the revolutionary ideas he later developed.
It is, and that contrast seems to have fueled a tremendous internal conflict right from the beginning. His home life was tense, his father was a successful surgeon, and Foucault later described him quite darkly as a bully.
A bully. A bully who subjected him to stern punishment. So you have this nominal Catholic upbringing, and while he was intellectually brilliant, excelling in history, Greek, Latin, French, he famously struggled with mathematics. He saw it as rigid, inaccessible.
And that tension, it seems to have manifested in some extreme psychological distress very early on. This wasn't just, typical teenage angst.
No. He attempted suicide around 1948, and again in the years after that, he had periods of really intense psychological turmoil.
And the state of his mind during his time at the prestigious École Normale Supérieure, the ENS, is just.
Yeah.
It's deeply revealing about his intellectual path.
Absolutely. You have to picture this. He wasn't decorating his room with typical student posters. He adorned his walls with Prince of Francisco Goya's images of torture and war.
Like the disasters of war.
Exactly. This reflects an early, intense fascination with violence, the macabre, and the absolute limits of human suffering. These were the very limits he would later trace in his work on punishment and madness.
And we know the ENS doctor at the time, he attributed these suicidal tendencies to the distress Foucault felt about his homosexuality, which in post-war France was a profound social taboo.
It was. But instead of retreating, Foucault did the opposite. He actively sought out danger, he pushed boundaries, he explored the underground, often perilous Parisian gay scene, and he experimented with drug use.
So there's a key connection there to his philosophy.
It's the key connection. Long before he formally theorized limited experiences, Foucault was living them. He was exploring what society defined as deviance, as distress, as the non-normative. His time at the ENS was marked by this obsession with transgressive literature figures like Sade and Bataille people who were trying to write themselves outside of conventional morality.
So the intersection of his personal identity, society's judgment of it, and this fascination with transgression, that directly laid the groundwork for madness and civilization.
It's the seed of everything that comes later.
So while he was living through this internal battle, he was also getting a really rigorous intellectual foundation.
Yes, he studied under the historian and philosopher Jean Hippolyte at the Lycée Henri IV. And Hippolyte instilled in him this fundamental conviction that philosophy cannot operate in a historical vacuum.
I have to be grounded.
It has to be. Any true philosophical inquiry, Foucault decided, must be developed through a meticulous, rigorous study of history.
And this historical lens, it briefly led him into political alignment with communism.
It did. Under the encouragement of his tutor, the Marxist philosopher Louis Althusser, Foucault joined the French Communist Party, the FCP, in 1950.
But this was a pretty short-lived dalliance, right? He was never a doctrinaire Marxist.
Not at all. He famously rejected the idea that history was solely driven by economic class struggle. He found that too simplistic.
And he left pretty quickly.
By 1953, he was out. He was completely disillusioned by the pervasive atmosphere of bigotry. There was the obvious homophobia he experienced firsthand within the party ranks.
Of course.
And then the broader anti-Semitism that was on display during the Soviet doctors' plot in the early 1950s.
Right, where Jewish doctors were falsely accused of conspiring against Soviet leaders.
Exactly. So for Foucault, the party had failed the test of genuine liberation and ethical consistency.
But the real fundamental intellectual watershed moment that happened during a trip to Italy around that same time, 1953.
Yes. This is when he immersed himself in the work of Friedrich Nietzsche, particularly Untimely Meditations.
And he called this a revelation.
It was. We really need to linger here, because Nietzsche remained a core fundamental influence for the rest of his life. He basically dictated Foucault's entire intellectual trajectory.
So what did Nietzsche offer him? What was the revelation?
Nietzsche offered him a way out of the intellectual corner Foucault felt trapped in.
What corner was that, specifically? What was the prevailing philosophical climate he was trying to escape?
Well, at the ENS, the dominant modes of thought were Marxism, phenomenology, and existentialism. All brilliant in their own right, of course, but Foucault found them restrictive.
How so?
Existentialism, even with its emphasis on freedom, still often centered on a search for an authentic, pre-existing subject, or self. Marxism sought a universal historical path moving toward a predetermined endpoint, which was communism.
And Nietzsche gave him a way to break from that.
Nietzsche allowed him to reject that whole pursuit of universal truths or destiny. Untimely Meditations argues for a form of history that doesn't look for ultimate origins or grand narratives. Instead, it investigates the messy, the contingent, the often violent beginnings of our concepts.
It gives philosophy the tool of genealogy.
Precisely. A way to study the accidents, the power struggles, the sheer arbitrary nature of how things came to be, without projecting some fixed human nature or historical endpoint onto the material. This was the break he needed.
And that conceptual break was reinforced by culture, too. He cited seeing Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot in Paris around that time as another major break from those schools of thought that insisted on meaning and destiny.
Right, so equipped with degrees in philosophy and psychology, he starts his professional career, and his early experiences directly informed his later critique of power.
He spent time as an unofficial intern at the Sainte-Anne Hospital, right? In the Psychiatric Institute.
He did. This was hands-on research. He was studying the doctor-patient relationship. He was aiding in experiments. This experience just showed him firsthand the institutional mechanisms of medical knowledge, how the expert establishes dominance, how illness is defined and controlled.
The groundwork for madness and civilization and the birth of the clinic.
All of it. And that led to his first book, Maladie mentale et personnalité, in 1954, which was conceptually radical for the time. It theorized that mental illness itself was culturally relative.
A perspective that drew on Marx, Heidegger, anthropologists like Margaret Mead.
All of them. But surprisingly, Foucault later came to absolutely despise this work. He actually tried to prevent its republication, feeling it was too conventional, too psychological, and just lacked the radical intellectual force, the fire and flair of his later projects.
And that dissatisfaction drove him abroad for 5 crucial years. He served as a cultural diplomat in Sweden, Poland, and West Germany.
And these years away from the sort of intense French academic scene allowed him to develop his ideas free from the immediate scrutiny of his peers.
His time in Sweden was intellectually productive, right? He was gathering material for Madness and Civilization.
He was at Uppsala University, but his doctoral thesis was actually rejected there. A positivist historian felt his methods were too speculative, not rigorous enough. Another little foreshadowing of later critiques.
And his time in Poland. That provided the ultimate real-world lesson in institutional surveillance.
Oh, yes. He was the director of the French Cultural Center in Warsaw, and during this period he became involved in a relationship with a Polish security agent.
A security agent. What was the context there?
It was classic Cold War stuff. The agent was trying to use Foucault's homosexuality, which was illegal and severely punished in Poland, to either blackmail him or compel him to act as an informer.
An entrapment attempt.
A blatant one. And when it became clear, it escalated into a diplomatic scandal, forcing Foucault to abruptly flee to West Germany. So the man who would spend his life analyzing how institutions watch and categorize people, he was himself an early target of state surveillance and disciplinary power.
That period abroad then culminates in his return to France and the establishment of his first truly revolutionary philosophical method, which he termed archaeology.
Archaeology is such a fantastic metaphor for what he was doing. It's about digging down through the layers of history, not to find continuous progress, but to unearth the hidden rules, the very foundation that made knowledge possible in a given period.
So his archaeology sought to examine the historical conditions of truth itself.
Exactly. Not what is true, but what was it possible to say as true at this time.
And his first three major histories, Madness and Civilization, The Birth of the Clinic, and The Order of Things, all use this approach. So let's start with the one that gave him his initial fame, Madness and Civilization from 1961.
This book was monumental. Foucault wasn't just writing a history of psychiatry. He was arguing that madness, as we understand it, is a social construct that's distinct from mental illness. He traced how society defines, excludes, and manages those it labels mad.
And he showed that these definitions shift dramatically over time. In the Renaissance, for instance, madness was often interwoven with creativity or mystical fate. It had a place in the culture.
Right. It had a kind of cultural resonance. Then, in the classical age of the 17th and 18th centuries, something shifts dramatically with what Foucault calls the Great Confinement.
And that confinement is key.
It's absolutely key. Madness suddenly became tangled up with other forms of social deviance, poverty, criminality, unemployment, illness. And all of these people were confined together in massive institutions like the Hôpital Général in Paris.
So madness was no longer a tragic fate. It became a moral failing linked to idleness and disorder.
Precisely. And he argues that the modern medicalized view of mental illness only emerged after the Enlightenment, once the moral and political rationale for that confinement had kind of run its course. It became a medical problem rather than a moral one.
The book resonated so strongly that it became a foundational text for the anti-psychiatry movement in the 1960s.
It did. Though while he appreciated the spirit of the movement, Foucault later distanced himself slightly. He argued they sometimes missed the historical nuance. They focused on the evil of institutions rather than the structural logic that made the institutionalization of madness possible in the first place.
Then came The Birth of the Clinic in 1963, where he applied this archaeological method to medicine. And here he introduced the pivotal concept of the medical gaze.
The medical gaze is such a powerful idea. Foucault wasn't interested in the history of medical breakthroughs, the story of penicillin. He was interested in how the spatial reorganization of hospitals and the institutionalization of clinical teaching in the late 18th century created a new way of looking at the human body.
Before this, doctors relied heavily on symptoms, on what the patient told them.
On the narrative, yes. But post-1800, particularly with the rise of autopsies and pathology, the body became an object of systematic, objective observation, classification, and intervention, even while the patient was alive.
The doctor's gaze cuts through the subjective narrative to the objective truth of the lesion or the organ.
Exactly. And then the book that brought him unexpected fame, The Order of Things, an archaeology of the human sciences in 1966.
This explored a much broader question. How did man become an object of knowledge in the first place? And here he introduced the concept of the episteme.
Okay, so that is a highly technical, dense term. If we think of Foucault as digging up historical foundations, what exactly is the episteme?
You can think of the episteme as the invisible underlying architectural blueprint of knowledge for a specific historical period.
The unspoken rules.
The unspoken, unquestioned rules. The conditions of truth that determine what is acceptable scientific discourse, what is considered rational, and what questions can even be asked in the first place.
So it's the mental furniture of an era that the people living within it can't perceive.
Right, because it's the air they breathe, and that's why the book caused such a stir. Foucault argued these conditions shift dramatically, like a geological upheaval, making certain types of thought possible in one era and utterly impossible in the next.
And he analyzed the episteme of the Renaissance, which was based on resemblance and analogy, then the classical age, based on representation and order, and finally the modern age, based on history and man as both subject and object of knowledge.
The book was a surprise French bestseller, and because he was describing these underlying, seemingly fixed structures of knowledge, he got temporarily associated with the structuralist movement, people like Lévi-Strauss and Lacan.
An association he soon vehemently rejected.
Right. And if the episteme is supposed to be invisible, how did Foucault manage to spot these shifts when they are supposedly invisible to the people living within them?
That's precisely the challenge that led him to evolve his method. He rejected structuralism because they were seeking universal, timeless, ahistorical structures. Foucault was doing the opposite. He was focused on historically localized practices of discourse.
So this shift, the move from describing the structure of acceptable knowledge, archaeology, to explaining the messy, nonlinear process of how those structures change, is what spurred the evolution of his method in the 1970s.
And that's where we get genealogy.
Genealogy, the corrective method.
Heavily influenced by Nietzsche's historical method, genealogy focuses explicitly on the roles power relations play in society. Instead of searching for the noble origins of an idea, genealogy investigates its ignoble, contingent, and often violent beginnings. It focuses on the battles and struggles that caused the episteme to shift.
So archaeology describes the structure, and genealogy explains the power-based friction that leads to succession.
Exactly. And this methodological shift is what truly defines his most influential later work, culminating in Discipline and Punish in 1975 and The History of Sexuality in 1976.
Now, we arrive at the concept Foucault is universally known for power.
Yeah.
But we have to stress that Foucault's definition of power is radically different from the one most of us carry around.
Absolutely. He fundamentally rejected what he called the hydraulic or economic model of power. He was very critical of the liberal view that power is simply what the state holds, or the Marxist view that it's owned by an oppressive class.
He found these incomplete.
Deeply incomplete, because they only describe power as a negative force, as a tool that says no.
Right, something that represses or prohibits.
And he argued that focusing solely on that subtractive nature of state power laws, police, censorship, has effectively hidden other, far more pervasive forms of power that are actually productive.
Productive, they create things.
They create things. They create subjects, knowledge, reality itself. For Foucault, power is not a commodity you possess or a crown you wear. He described it instead as a complex group of constantly changing force relations, a network that results from inequality or difference.
So it comes from everything and therefore exists everywhere.
It's instantiated through specific techniques, practices, discourses, rather than being centrally held. So power isn't necessarily top-down.
Right. It operates at the micro level first, through singular tactics, how you speak, how you arrange your office, how a parent disciplines a child. And these micro tactics then aggregate into macro-level strategies, which is what we traditionally recognize as state policy or social structure.
And crucially, and this is so important, because power relations are fluid and constantly changing, they always include an element of resistance.
There's always pushback.
Always. Power cannot be exercised without the possibility of resistance, otherwise it would just be brute force. And this is why change is always possible, even if escaping the network of power entirely is not. The whole point of his work was to show the mechanisms of power so that we might resist them more effectively.
And to make this evolution of force relations clear, Foucault detailed 3 distinct historical forms of power that have shaped Western society, marking this shift from overt coercion to internalized control.
So let's begin with the oldest and most obvious, sovereign power.
This is the traditional pyramid-like structure where power is explicitly held by a single sovereign think, an absolute monarchy. Its action is fundamentally subtractive and public.
Right. The sovereign has the absolute right to take life, wealth, services, or labor from their subjects.
And its manifestation in punishment was gruesome spectacle. In Discipline and Punish, Foucault opens with a shocking, detailed account of the torture of Robert François Daimiel, who attempted to assassinate King Louis XV in 1757.
That opening passage is infamous for its clinical, almost detached cruelty. It's meant to shock you.
So describe what happened to Damiens and why Foucault chose it as the ultimate illustration of sovereign power.
Damiens was subjected to public torture for hours. His flesh was torn with hot pincers, molten lead was poured into his wounds, and finally he was drawn and quartered by 4 horses. The executioners even had to hack off his joints to finish the job because the horses weren't strong enough.
It's just horrific.
It is. But this wasn't just punishment for the man, it was a ritual. It was designed to repair the damage done to the king's body, the sovereign's mystical political body, which had been offended by the crime. The spectacle was meant to reinstate the overwhelming authority of the sovereign for all to see.
But Foucault noted that this spectacle was expensive, it was time-consuming, and ultimately it was counterproductive.
Deeply counterproductive. Spectators often sympathized with the victim's suffering rather than the sovereign's authority, which could lead to unrest. The system was just inefficient for a rapidly industrializing society that needed productive, predictable citizens.
And that inefficiency led to the emergence of the second, and for Foucault, the most defining form of modern power, disciplinary power.
Which starts roughly at the end of the 18th century. Punishment shifts away from the body and towards the management of the soul or the mind through the new penitentiary system.
And the key concept here is that disciplinary power is productive. It's not just about stopping bad behavior. Its goal is to make bodies useful and obedient for the state and the economy.
It instills rational self-control, meaning power becomes internalized by the individual. It's about molding, not subtracting.
And this molding operates through 3 primary overlapping technologies, which Foucault found in institutions like schools, hospitals, barracks, and factories, not just in prisons.
Let's take the first one, hierarchical observation.
Hierarchical observation.
This just means bodies are placed in spaces where they are constantly visible to a hierarchy of observers. The architecture itself facilitates surveillance. In a factory or a classroom, the foreman or the teacher observes the bodies below, ensuring they are productive, efficient, and conforming to established norms of movement and time.
And second, normalizing judgment.
This establishes a baseline, a norm, and then it punishes deviations from that norm, even very small ones. This is the use of techniques like rank, grades, and exams to categorize, reward, or penalize behavior.
So it moves beyond simply judging a crime, which sovereign power does, to judging whether your performance, your attitude, or your body measures up to some established expectation.
Exactly. And third, the exam. This is the ultimate technique because it combines observation with normalizing judgment.
It brings them together.
It does. The exam objectifies and individualizes the observed bodies. It creates extensive individualized documentation files, records, grades, psychological profiles, tracking your development and comparing your results against the established norm. It transforms the individual into a case study.
The genius and the horror of disciplinary power is that it requires surprisingly little overt force. The ultimate expression of this power, the formula, as Foucault called it, is Jeremy Bentham's panopticon.
The panopticon. It's an architectural design for an optimal prison, a circular building with individual cells facing a central, unseen guard tower.
Right. So the subject in the cell knows they might be watched at any given moment, but they never know for sure.
And the consequence is that the subject internalizes the surveillance. The power operates automatically. The prisoner regulates their own behavior as if they were constantly being watched, ensuring obedience even when the guard is absent.
You become your own warden.
You become your own warden. And this model, Foucault argued, extended far beyond the prison walls and became the organizational logic for modernity. Think about contemporary life. Corporate surveillance software monitoring employee productivity, personalized marketing tracking, or even performance review systems in large organizations.
They're all variations of the panoptic formula. They force the subject to become responsible for their own normalization.
Which brings us to the third and final form of power, which operates on an entirely different scale, biopower or biopolitics.
So if disciplinary power manages the individual body,
biopower manages the population, the collective bios or life of the species. It emerged alongside disciplinary power in the 18th century, but operates on a macro level.
So it's less concerned with telling one person how to behave and more concerned with optimizing and controlling aggregate data.
Exactly. Birth rates, life expectancy, public health, migration, crime statistics. It rests on internalized norms of collective health and security.
And sex and sexuality are central to biopower.
They're the nexus where the individual body and the population intersect. On a disciplinary level, non-reproductive acts might be pathologized. But on the biopower level, the state regulates contraception, it promotes specific family structures, and historically it encouraged certain social groups, those deemed fit, to reproduce, while actively discouraging or preventing others, like criminals or the poor, from having children.
It sounds chillingly scientific. And this is where Foucault introduces his great paradox regarding biopower. Though modern state actions are often motivated by the ambition to protect life itself, concealed under norms of collective health or humanitarian rhetoric.
Foucault argues that biopower has historically killed more people than previous sovereign power systems.
That sounds incredibly counterintuitive. How can a system designed to protect life be more lethal than one based on the sovereign's right to kill?
Because sovereign power takes life in the name of the law, it executes an offense. Biopower, conversely, kills in the name of life.
What do you mean?
It justifies mass violence by stating it is eliminating a biological threat to the population's health, purity, or security. It is the administration of life and death in the name of the collective norm.
The clearest historical example, which Foucault explicitly analyzed, is the rise of eugenics in the 19th century.
It arose directly from biopolitical concerns, inspired by Darwin's theories and Francis Galton's application of them.
Right, the middle class began to fear that rapid population growth in urban slums, with all its disease and crime, was preventing natural selection and causing a spread of negative qualities.
And the biopolitical response was to introduce state controls, sometimes subtle, sometimes brutal, including forced sterilizations, to manage the biological destiny of the population in the name of future collective health.
And the extreme culmination is Nazi Germany.
Exactly. The motivation for genocide was articulated not as an act of personal vengeance, which would be sovereign power, but as a necessary surgical action to protect German health and eliminate threats to the racial collective.
So biopower makes mass death possible by reframing it as a public health imperative, a crucial concept for understanding modern security states and humanitarian crises.
Foucault's analysis of power forces us to confront the individual body and the formation of the self, or what he called subjectivity. If power is productive and it's everywhere, it means we have to challenge the traditional Platonic view that the body is just a container for some objective hidden soul.
He argues that the body is anything but objective or outside of history. It's a surface, a text, that is continuously shaped by cultural norms, diet, fashion, work habits, medical interventions.
Disciplinary power is literally inscribed upon it, molding us into specific kinds of workers, students, or patients.
And this is where we get that truly iconic reversal. Foucault turns Plato's "the body is the prison of the soul" completely on its head.
He posits that the soul is the prison of the body.
That is a provocative statement. What exactly does Foucault mean by the soul here? He's not talking about a spiritual soul.
No, he means the social soul, the internalized self. The soul is the knowledge of what we ought to be, the conscience, the sense of identity, which is the product of continuous surveillance and normalization imposed by disciplinary techniques like schools and prisons.
So the soul is the internalized mechanism that disciplines the body, making it obedient and useful, confining its spontaneous desires within the bounds of social acceptability.
Exactly. And he applied this critique most explosively to sexuality, arguing that sex itself is not a timeless biological truth, but a normative, pseudoscientific historical construct used as an instrument of power and knowledge.
He was particularly frustrated by the popular discourse of the 1960s and 70s, which was all about the liberation of sexuality.
He contended that true liberation is a fantasy because escaping one set of norms simply ensures another, slightly different set rushes in to fill the void.
So he believed the goal of critical theory is not to achieve liberation.
No, but rather to constantly question and deny any identities posited as natural or essential.
This brings us to the core mechanism by which we are all created and controlled, assujettissement, or subjectivity.
A difficult word, but a crucial concept. It's the process where power simultaneously creates us as subjects, it gives us an identity, while simultaneously oppressing us using those social norms. We are subjected to norms and we become subjects who adhere to them.
The example Foucault uses in the history of sexuality is the invention of the homosexual.
Right. Before the 19th century, power controlled the axotomy was a temporary deviation, one of many forms of transgressive behavior. It was something you did.
But medical and psychological discourse, operating under these disciplinary and biopolitical systems, it transforms sodomy into the homosexual species, an identity.
Exactly. The person was then defined not by an act, but by a fixed nature, a past, a childhood, a type of life. This creation of a defined, medicalized identity allowed for intense discrimination and normalization, forcing individuals to locate their entire identity within this one category.
And yet, as Foucault noted, this process of subjection is never total. The very establishment of the homosexual subject also paradoxically led to the creation of institutions, gay bars, support groups, and movements like the Pride Parade.
Demonstrating how resistance is always woven into the fabric of power itself. It gives the subjected a common vocabulary and a place from which to fight back.
We can see this in contemporary life, too. If you think about the pressure to maintain a perfectly curated, often professionalized, digital self on social media, the authentic self demanded by these platforms is not a liberation, it's a new subjectivity.
That's a great example. We are subjected to the norms of visibility, of metrics, of personal branding, and we become subjects who willingly perform that labor, monitoring ourselves according to platform algorithms and corporate expectations.
So if we're all shaped by these historical and cultural forces, where does that leave the concept of freedom? If power is everywhere, is freedom just an illusion?
Well, Foucault defined freedom not as an escape from power, which he saw as impossible, but as what we can do within our specific historical context.
So freedom is conditioned on awareness.
It's conditioned on awareness.
Huh.
Once we know how power has shaped us, we retain the capacity to change the factors that limit us. Freedom, then, is not a state of being, but a continuous practice.
And this leads directly to the practice of critique.
Which Foucault saw as an alternative to the modern search for certainty. Critique is the constant, rigorous questioning of who we are right now. It means tracing the messy, contingent processes that led to our current state of being.
This critical ontology of the present is Foucault's ultimate tool.
It is. It shows that the way things are is not necessary, not inevitable, but merely constructed by historical accidents and power struggles. And if it's constructed, it can be dismantled or changed.
And in his later work, he turned to antiquity to explore practical ways individuals achieved this form of active, resistant freedom, focusing on the ancient Greek term epimeleia hutu.
The care for the self. This was presented as a philosophical counterpoint to the modern, often neurotic, search for the true self. The modern notion often assumes the self is some hidden treasure that introspection or confession will reveal.
But Foucault argues that the self is not discovered.
It is constituted or created in the very activities we perform to find it.
That is a significant difference. You don't find your true self. You build your ethical self through deliberate actions.
Exactly. The goal is to create an ethical self through specific, formalized practices, what he called technologies of the self. This includes things like stoic contemplation, the ascesis, where you review your past actions and contemplate future actions to ensure they align with your values.
So it's a fascinating return to classical ethics. But does Foucault ultimately offer hope that these practices allow us to truly escape power?
He adds a critical caution. While these techniques are about ethical self-creation, the form for this ethical subject is, in large part, already constituted by the external power structures, the schools, the workplaces, the government systems that shape our lives.
So we're always creating a self in relation to power.
Even in the act of resistance, the ethical struggle is continuous, it's never finally resolved.
Foucault was not merely a quiet academic. He was a highly engaged, militant intellectual who brought his radical theories directly into the political arena.
His work was absolutely inseparable from his action. In 1971, he co-founded the Groupe d'Information sur les Prisons, or GIP.
The GIP. Their mission was direct and provocative, to expose poor prison conditions and, crucially, to give prisoners and ex-prisoners a voice in French society.
They wanted to circumvent the usual channels of authority. They didn't want reforms dictated by bureaucrats. They wanted to hear from the confined. They employed radical techniques, staging protests related to prison riots, directly challenging the state's monopoly on information.
So he was putting his theories into practice.
He was. Foucault and the GIP believed the penal system was actively hardening petty criminals into delinquents through its disciplinary techniques, thereby proving his theoretical point in real time. This often put him directly in conflict with the police.
He was also deeply committed to anti-racist campaigns.
Very much so. Following a wave of perceived racist violence against North African migrant workers, he became a leading figure in protests in the early 1970s.
And this commitment led to that famous incident in 1972, where Foucault was arrested alongside his literary hero, Jean Genet.
Right, during a protest against the police killing of an Algerian worker. Foucault understood that the state's use of violence and its classification of certain bodies as dangerous or disposable was a core function of biopower, and he was willing to put his own body on the line to resist it.
Yet his politics were often complex and controversial, particularly his reporting on the 1978 Iranian Revolution for an Italian newspaper.
Yes, that was very controversial. He visited Tehran and met with opposition leaders, and he expressed a sense of awe regarding Ayatollah Khomeini's Islamist movement, describing it as a potentially revolutionary political spirituality.
And he was heavily criticized for this.
He was, particularly by Iranian expatriates and the French press, who saw him as minimizing the violent potential of the regime. Foucault's defense was that Islamism was undeniably becoming a major political force, and the West needed to treat it with respect and analysis rather than immediately dismissing it as irrational.
He was trying to understand a non-Western eruption of resistance, even if he didn't endorse its eventual outcome.
That was his position. Meanwhile, his academic star just continued to rise. His lectures at the prestigious Collège de France became essential events in Parisian intellectual life.
And the 1970s brought him frequently to the United States, where his popularity grew immensely, particularly at UC Berkeley.
And it was during one of those California visits in 1975 that Foucault had that profoundly life-altering LSD experience in Death Valley.
That is just an incredible detour from the highest halls of French academia to a life-altering acid trip in the California desert. Is that kind of limit experience essential to how he views the construction of the self?
It absolutely was. While in the desert, listening to Richard Strauss and Charles Ives, Foucault reported that the experience profoundly changed his life and his work. He called it the greatest experience of his life.
And the intellectual consequence was immediate and dramatic.
It was. It led him to completely scrap the nearly finished second manuscript of the History of Sexuality and rethink the entire project. He pivoted from analyzing the mechanisms of prohibition to focusing on the historical ways people construct themselves ethically, the very reason he began exploring the ancient Greek care for the self.
During these visits, he also openly engaged with the San Francisco sadomasochistic gay scene.
He did. He saw people there actively designing new ethical and consensual rules for pleasure. He praised these activities as the real creation of new possibilities of pleasure, which people had no idea about previously. It was a practical, real-world instantiation of his philosophical project.
His life ended tragically in 1984 from complications of HIV/AIDS. He was the first major public figure in France to die from the disease.
An event that significantly changed mass awareness of the pandemic and spurred activism. In fact, his partner, Daniel Defert, founded the first national HIV/AIDS organization in France, AIDS in Foucault's memory, solidifying his practical legacy.
Foucault's influence is just immense. It spans critical theory, criminology, post-colonialism. Edward Said's Orientalism is a Foucauldian text in many respects, and feminist philosophy, particularly in Judith Butler's work.
But this influence came wrapped in persistent, powerful criticism. We should probably touch on the three major intellectual debates surrounding his legacy.
Okay. First, the charge of immoralism, which was famously crystallized in that 1971 televised debate with the philosopher Noam Chomsky.
Right. Chomsky, who bases his critique of injustice on a universal, fixed human nature, was genuinely struck by Foucault's total rejection of those ideas. If there is no universal human nature, what is the basis for saying torture is wrong? Chomsky later recalled Foucault seeming completely amoral.
And Foucault's response was that he didn't need a fixed nature to critique injustice.
He just needed to show that the conditions that create injustice were historically contingent and therefore could be changed.
Second, the charge of cryptonormativity, articulated most forcefully by Jürgen Habermas.
Habermas argued that Foucault's critique is fundamentally self-refuting. If Foucault claims there is no universal basis for justice or freedom, how can he consistently argue that prison conditions are intolerable?
Right. Habermas asserted that Foucault's entire critique secretly relies on the very Enlightenment ideals like freedom from domination that he claims to be historicizing away.
In other words, he's using the ladder of enlightenment to tear down the building of enlightenment, but he needs the ladder to stand on. A concise way to put it.
And third, the most radical philosophical broadside came from Jean Baudrillard's 1977 tract, Forget Foucault.
Baudrillard didn't just critique the ideas. He asserted that Foucault's extensive discourse on power and sexuality wasn't challenging power at all, it was simply mirroring it. or maybe even marking its demise.
What was Baudrillard's ultimate claim?
He claimed that the very possibility of academics talking about power with such detached, definitive understanding, codifying it, writing histories of it, meant that its intense revolutionary period was already here and now over with.
So Foucault's analysis was an elegant obituary, not a battle plan.
That's a good way to put it. And Foucault never formally replied, which some saw as an admission of the critique's power. And of course, we must mention the critiques from historians who repeatedly criticized him for what they saw as a lack of empirical precision and sweeping generalizations.
But regardless of the critiques, the sheer force of his insights into how knowledge and power intersect to shape our world makes him an indispensable intellectual touchstone.
He gave us the vocabulary to understand modern forms of control that simply weren't visible before.
So we've traced Foucault's path from a deeply conflicted youth obsessed with limited experiences to the man who gave us the tools to analyze modern social control. We've covered his core revolutionary argument that power is not purely repressive or subtractive, but profoundly productive.
It's productive. It shapes everything from the structure of our institutions, like the omnipresent panopticon, to our deepest, most personalized sense of self and sexuality.
And that productive nature is the key takeaway for you, the listener.
It is. Foucault's work offers what he called a critical ontology of the present. It is a tool. It compels us to investigate the historical contingencies of our current reality. By showing that the way things are, the definitions of sanity, of criminality, of health, is not necessary but constructed, he opens up the possibility for deliberate, thoughtful change.
It forces you to question not just the system, but yourself within the system.
Precisely. If, as Foucault suggests, the self is constituted, created in activities such as the ones employed to find the self, then we have to constantly ask, what everyday practice are you currently performing? Maybe it's the ritualistic use of a fitness tracker to optimize your body, or the constant curation of your professional biography online, or even the way you talk about your mental health.
Practices that you assume are simply natural,
But might actually be shaping you into a particular kind of subject, one dictated by invisible forces of power knowledge. That awareness, that constant critique, is the most crucial and perhaps the most demanding practice Foucault leaves us with.